Some folks say a woman can lose everything and still find her way back. But Ellie Thorne had buried that hope along with her husband 20 winters ago. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, coffee-stained, and bearing a return address she didn't recognize. Standing in the doorway of her temporary rental, Ellie's calloused fingers traced the unfamiliar lawyer's name as a gust of autumn wind scattered fallen leaves across her boots. The news was blunt. Margaret Maggie. Thorne. Sister. Age 52. Deceased. Natural causes. No funeral by request. The inheritance consisted of a cabin in Bitter Hollow, wherever the hell that was, and one dog, elderly, answering to the name Boone. Ellie twisted the thin gold band on her ring finger, a habit that had persisted through 2 decades of widowhood. 20 years of drifting from one hospital to another. Her nursing skills always in demand, never staying long enough to form connections that hurt when they inevitably broke. Maggie, her big sister. They hadn't spoken since that final explosive argument when Ellie packed her belongings and walked away from the only family she had left. "You can't just disappear because David died," Maggie had shouted at her retreating back. "He wouldn't want this for you." But Ellie had disappeared anyway. And now Maggie was gone too. The drive to Bitter Hollow took her through country that grew wilder with each passing mile. Paved roads surrendered to gravel, then to dirt tracks winding between towering pines and granite outcroppings. Cell service vanished along with the road signs, leaving nothing but wilderness and a growing sense that she was traveling backward in time. When she finally found the turnoff, marked only by a weathered post with "Thorn" carved into sun-bleached wood, Ellie felt something shift in her chest. This was real. Maggie had been real. Had lived in this place, had died here alone. The cabin sat in a clearing that caught the late afternoon sunlight, golden rays illuminating what should have been neglected property but wasn't. The small porch looked recently swept. A perfect stack of firewood stood beside a door with fresh-looking hinges. The front garden boasted neat rows of autumn vegetables. "This can't be right," Ellie murmured, checking the address again. That's when she saw him. Under an old apple tree lay a large golden retriever, watching her with intelligence in his rheumy eyes. His muzzle had gone white, and when he finally stood to greet her, his movements were slow and deliberate, favoring his right hind leg. "Boone." "So you're my inheritance too, are you?" Ellie asked softly. The dog approached slowly, sniffed her offered hand, then sat back on his haunches and studied Ellie with what could only be described as judgment. His tail thumped once against the ground, as if acknowledging the complexity of their situation. Inside, the cabin told a different story than Ellie had expected. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating the far wall. A narrow staircase led to what must be a sleeping loft. Every available wall space held bookshelves, packed with volumes on military history, natural medicine, philosophy, and, surprisingly, advanced nursing techniques, many of them dog-eared and annotated in Maggie's precise handwriting. "I didn't know you were interested in my field," Ellie whispered, tracing the spine of a book she herself used in trauma care. In the kitchen, she found bags of premium dog food and precisely labeled medication bottles with Boone's name on veterinary labels. Heart medication, arthritis pills, something for seizures. Maggie had been taking care of this animal with the dedication of someone who had little else to care for. Or perhaps someone who understood the value of unconditional love. That first night, Ellie slept on Maggie's couch, Boone lying nearby, close enough to reach out and touch, but maintaining a careful distance. As darkness settled over Bitter Hollow, bringing sounds Ellie hadn't heard in decades, owl calls, the rustle of small creatures, wind sighing through pine needles, she found herself wondering about the paths that had led both sisters to this place. When Boone whimpered in his sleep, Ellie instinctively reached out to soothe him. Her nurse's eyes noticed the slight inflammation around an old scar on his paw. The next morning, she cleaned and treated it with antibiotic ointment she found in Maggie's well-stocked first aid kit. The dog watched her with surprised appreciation, as if unaccustomed to such tender care from anyone but Maggie. I may not be your person, Ellie told him, gently wrapping the paw, but I do know a thing or two about patching up wounds. That night, as stars blanketed the mountain sky with impossible brilliance, Ellie sat on the porch with Boone beside her. For the first time in 20 years, the restlessness that had driven her from town to town, hospital to hospital, was quiet. She breathed in the pine-scented air and felt something inside her unclench just slightly. On the fourth day, everything changed. Ellie was splitting kindling behind the cabin when she noticed Boone standing rigid near the old shed, his entire body quivering with focused energy. The retriever's ears pricked forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. Urgent, insistent. "What is it, boy?" Boone began to pace, nose pressed to the earth, movements methodical and deliberate. Then he started to dig with surprising vigor for a dog his age. Dirt flew from his paws in steady streams as he paused only to thrust his muzzle deeper into the growing hole. When Ellie knelt beside him, her words died in her throat. About 18 inches down, partially exposed by Boone's efforts, something metallic caught the light. Not the dull gleam of a buried tool, but the deliberate shine of manufactured metal. With trembling hands, Ellie continued the excavation, revealing a sturdy strongbox. The box was heavy, secured with a padlock green with age but still solid. Using tools from Maggie's shed, she cut through the lock, hesitating only briefly before lifting the lid. Inside lay stacks of currency bound with deteriorating rubber bands, bearer bonds, gold certificates, wealth on a scale Ellie couldn't comprehend. But it was the newspaper clipping folded at the bottom that made her blood run cold. "Armored car robbery leaves 2 dead, 3.2 million missing," screamed the headline from the Millfield Chronicle, dated September 15th, 1998. Below that, federal investigation ongoing. Suspects remain at large. Ellie sank onto the ground, legs suddenly unable to support her. "Oh, Maggie, what did you do?" The sound of tires on gravel interrupted her thoughts. A sheriff's department SUV was approaching the cabin, moving slowly along the rough logging road. Ellie quickly returned the strongbox to the hole, covering it with a tarp, and walked around to the front yard as the vehicle stopped. A man in his early 50s emerged, adjusting his hat. His weathered face held kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, but there was wariness there too, the look of someone who missed very little. "Ms. Thorne? I'm Sheriff Kyle Morrison. I heard you'd come up to settle Margaret's affairs." His handshake was firm, his eyes direct and assessing. But what truly surprised Ellie was Boone's reaction. The dog approached Morrison with his tail wagging enthusiastically, accepting head scratches with obvious familiarity. "Hey there, old boy," Morrison said, kneeling to greet the retriever. "You doing okay with your new person?" "How well did you know my sister?" Ellie asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Morrison straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "Margaret called the department a few times over the past year. Said she'd been seeing strangers around the property, people asking questions in town about her." "What kind of questions?" "Oh, the usual things people ask when they're trying to find someone who doesn't want to be found. How long she'd lived here. Whether she had family." His eyes met hers directly. Margaret seemed to think these folks might have ulterior motives. After Morrison left, Ellie returned to the strongbox, carrying it into the cabin. $3 million. Her sister, involved in armed robbery. 2 men dead. None of it made sense. Not the Maggie she had known. But had she ever really known her sister at all? That night, Ellie saw them. Brief flashes of light moving through the trees, too deliberate to be natural. Flashlights, carried by people trying to approach without being seen. Heart pounding, she retreated to the bedroom and began searching frantically for anything that might explain Maggie's connection to the robbery. Behind a loose board in the wall, her fingers found a manila folder thick with documents, newspaper clippings, printed articles, even copies of police reports. But these weren't the materials of someone celebrating a successful heist. They read more like the research of a person tormented by guilt, seeking to understand every consequence of actions they couldn't undo. Maggie had tracked the investigation's progress, documented the lives of the murdered guards, compiled information about their families. One obituary made Ellie's stomach turn. Daniel Reeves, aged 34, survived by wife Jennifer and twin daughters. The photo showed a man in uniform smiling beside his young family. The next morning, Ellie drove into the nearest town, a collection of buildings that barely qualified as a settlement. At the only general store, she met Martha Wilson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who regarded her with immediate recognition. "You must be Maggie's sister," Martha said, bagging Ellie's groceries. "Got her chin and that same way of standing, straight-backed, like you're ready for anything." "Did you know her well?" Martha's hands paused. "Well enough to know she wasn't what she seemed. That woman carried burdens." She leaned forward. "Those city folk were back yesterday, asking after you now. Fancy car, expensive clothes, cold eyes." Back at the cabin, Ellie found a leather-bound journal hidden beneath a floorboard in the kitchen. The entries began 3 years earlier and continued almost until Maggie's death, chronicling a woman's struggle with conscience and fear. "They found me again today. 3 of them, this time asking old Peterson at the general store if he knew where the Thorne place was. Peterson's too smart to give strangers directions to isolated cabins, but they'll figure it out eventually. They always do. I never should have taken Vicky's deal. 25 years. And I still wake up seeing Danny Reeves's face when that gun went off." But Carver made it sound so simple. Inside information, clean getaway, nobody gets hurt. She lied about everything else, so why did I believe that part? Boone knows something's wrong. Dogs always know. With each page, a different Maggie emerged. Not a willing criminal, but a desperate graduate student coerced into providing inside information about armored car routes by Victoria Vicky Carver, a woman with organized crime connections who had discovered Maggie's gambling debts. The robbery had gone wrong from the start. What was supposed to be a simple theft turned violent when a guard drew his weapon. In the chaos, both guards died, and Maggie watched helplessly from the getaway car, trapped in circumstances she'd never intended. In a sealed envelope tucked between the journal's final pages, Ellie found a letter addressed to her. "Sister, if you're reading this, then Boone has shown you where I hid the money, and you know what I did 25 years ago. I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. Some sins are too heavy for that. But I need you to understand that I never intended for anyone to die. Victoria Carver is still out there, still looking for me. She believes I know the location of the money the other crew members hid, but I was never part of their inner circle. The money in the strongbox belongs to the families of the men who died. I should have returned it years ago, but I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. Maybe you'll have more courage than your sister ever did. Take care of Boone. He's been the only family I deserved. Maggie." Beneath the letter was a small stack of newspaper clippings. Not about the robbery, but about Ellie. Articles featuring the field hospital where she'd worked after a hurricane. A small mention of a nursing award she'd received 5 years ago. Photographs from hospital newsletters showing Ellie with patients. Maggie had been following her sister's life from afar, collecting these small glimpses into a world she couldn't share. Tears blurred Ellie's vision as she realized her sister had never stopped caring, even when Ellie had walked away. A sound outside made her look up sharply. Boone had moved to the front door and was growling low in his throat. Through gaps in the curtains, Ellie could see a black SUV parked beside her truck. Three well-dressed people stood nearby, and even at a distance she could tell they weren't local. "Mr. Thorne, we'd like to speak with you about your sister." The voice from outside was cultured, almost friendly, but carried an unmistakable undertone of threat that made Boone's growling intensify. Ellie's nursing experience in conflict zones kicked in. Assess the situation, identify exits, protect the vulnerable. She quickly placed her hand on Boone's head to quiet him, gathered the most important documents, and headed for the back of the cabin. Behind a heavy wooden cabinet in the kitchen, just where another of Maggie's maps had indicated, she found the concealed entrance to a root cellar. The cabinet slid aside more easily than its appearance suggested, revealing a narrow opening that dropped down into darkness. "Search everything," commanded a woman's voice, now inside the cabin. "She's here somewhere, and so is our property." Boone followed Ellie into the cellar, moving with surprising agility. Together, they crawled through a tunnel that angled upward through the hillside, emerging into a small clearing about 100 yards behind the cabin. From this position, Ellie could see the building and the black SUV, as well as two additional vehicles that had arrived. Men and women moved with military precision, establishing a perimeter while others searched inside. According to Maggie's map, there were supply caches scattered throughout the forest. Ellie located one buried beneath a cairn of stones, arranged in a specific pattern. Inside the waterproof container, wrapped in oiled canvas, she found what her sister had prepared: a military-grade rifle with tactical scope, ammunition, and a ghillie suit. But it was the wooden box at the bottom that made Ellie's hands tremble. Inside lay military decorations: a silver star, bronze stars with V device for valor, a purple heart with oak leaf clusters. Her sister, her quiet, bookish sister, had been a decorated combat veteran with multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Margaret Thorne, Army Rangers, had distinguished herself repeatedly in ways that earned the highest respect. The woman who had participated in the Millfield robbery hadn't been a career criminal. She'd been a hero undone by circumstances and bad choices, carrying guilt that eventually drove her into isolation. In Maggie's final journal entries, Ellie found something that connected their paths. "Boone was with my unit in Kandahar. He detected the IED that would have killed us all. When he was injured and set to be euthanized, I couldn't let that happen. He saved us once. I've been trying to save him ever since." Ellie looked at the old dog with new understanding. He wasn't just a pet. He was a fellow veteran, a brother in arms to Maggie. The distant sound of a helicopter broke through her thoughts. The helicopter wasn't part of Carver's team. Through her scope, Ellie watched as Sheriff Morrison emerged from the tree line below, service weapon drawn. His voice, amplified by a bullhorn, carried clearly through the forest. "Victoria Carver, this is Sheriff Kyle Morrison. You and your people need to drop your weapons and surrender immediately. The area is surrounded." Gunfire erupted as Carver's people opened fire on Morrison's position. The sheriff dove for cover, returning fire with practiced precision. What happened next shattered everything Ellie thought she understood. Boone, despite his age and infirmity, suddenly bolted from her side, racing down the hillside toward the gunfight. The dog moved with purpose and urgency that seemed impossible given his condition. "Boone!" Ellie shouted, abandoning her concealed position to follow. What she saw when she reached the edge of the firefight stopped her cold. Boone had positioned himself between Morrison and the hostile gunfire, and Morrison was speaking to the dog with the familiarity of a longtime partner. "Good boy," he said, reloading his weapon. "Just like old times." Morrison keyed a radio attached to his vest. "This is Agent Morrison, FBI. Subjects are armed and dangerous. Authorization to use deadly force granted. FBI, not a small-town sheriff." A federal agent who had been working undercover, watching Maggie and waiting for exactly this moment. A new voice cut through the chaos. Enough! The shooting stopped abruptly. An elegant woman in her 60s with silver hair stepped into view, her expensive clothing absurdly formal in the mountain setting. Morrison, I know you can hear me. Let's discuss this like civilized people. There's nothing to discuss, Carver, Morrison called back. You're under arrest for murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. Victoria Carver laughed, the sound incongruously gentle. You've been watching that cabin for 3 years, waiting for me to make exactly this mistake. But you still don't understand what's really happening here. She gestured toward the forest where Ellie had been hiding. Margaret Thorne was never just a criminal. She was working for you people from the beginning, wasn't she? The robbery, the hiding, all of it was federal theater designed to flush out the real targets. Morrison's expression confirmed the impossible truth. Margaret Thorne is dead, he replied tightly. Whatever arrangement existed died with her. But her sister isn't dead, Carver said, and Ellie felt ice form in her stomach. Through the scope, Ellie watched Carver display something on a phone screen to Morrison. Even at a distance, she could see his body language change. Surprise, then anger, then resignation. Show yourself, Ms. Thorne, Carver called toward Ellie's position. Let's clear up this misunderstanding before anyone else gets hurt. Ellie hesitated, but Boone's distress was becoming obvious. The old dog was struggling to breathe, the stress pushing his damaged heart beyond its limits. Against every survival instinct, she emerged from the tree line with her rifle lowered. She's got photos, Morrison said quietly when she was close enough. Pictures of you at the cabin with the strong box. They've been watching for weeks. He continued, his voice low and urgent. Your sister was working undercover for the Bureau, Ellie. The robbery was a sting operation that went wrong when Carver decided to eliminate witnesses. Margaret spent 25 years maintaining her cover while feeding us intelligence. Boone collapsed beside Morrison, his breathing shallow. The stress had finally overwhelmed his failing heart. Morrison pulled a small metal container from inside his jacket. The second strong box. Margaret left this specifically for you. She knew you might end up here. Inside, Ellie found Maggie's real FBI credentials, mission parameters, and a final letter explaining everything her sister had been forbidden to share while alive. If you're reading this, Carver has made her move, and Agent Morrison has revealed his identity. The choice you make next will determine whether two good men died for nothing, or whether their sacrifice finally brings justice. Boone will show you the way. He always has. The revelation that Maggie had been an undercover federal agent reframed everything. But as Boone lay gasping, the larger implications seemed less important than the immediate crisis. Beneath the credentials, Ellie found a tactical display device showing the positions of federal forces surrounding the area. Margaret had spent years preparing for this confrontation, and she'd known Ellie might be the one standing between Carver and justice when it happened. Victoria Carver's impatience grew visible. I'm growing tired of waiting, Morrison. The threat was clear. Her people were positioned to cause significant casualties if the standoff continued. Ellie made her decision with the clarity that had kept her focused through the worst trauma cases. She wasn't running anymore. Using her combat medical training and the tactical advantages Maggie had prepared, she would finish what her sister started. Boone, she said quietly, kneeling beside the dying dog. You showed me what Maggie needed me to see. Now it's time to finish this. The retriever's tail moved once against the forest floor. Acknowledgement, permission, farewell. Ellie activated the defensive systems Maggie had prepared throughout the property. Small explosive charges created diversions while she moved through the forest with the coordination of someone who had kept wounded soldiers alive under fire. Her medical training had taught her precision under pressure, how to make life-or-death decisions in seconds. Victoria Carver had made a fatal mistake. In her eagerness to end a 25-year hunt personally, she had exposed herself, trusting her numerical advantage to protect her. The shot that took down Victoria Carver was the kind that separated professionals from amateurs. Ellie's bullet found its target through shifting smoke and debris, not killing, but incapacitating the criminal mastermind. Tammy Carver, seeing her aunt fall, abandoned all tactical discipline and charged toward Ellie's position, walking directly into the crosshairs of federal agents converging on the clearing. The battle for Bitter Hollow ended not with Maggie's ultimate solution, but with the coordination of law enforcement officers who had waited years for this moment. 6 months later, Ellie stood in a federal courthouse in Denver, watching as Victoria Carver received her sentence. The trials had been swift, with overwhelming evidence ensuring justice for crimes that had festered in darkness for 25 years. Agent Kyle Morrison, his arm finally healed from wounds sustained during the firefight, stood beside her as the judge read the verdict. Life sentence without parole, federal seizure of assets, and most importantly, closure for the families of Daniel Reeves and Robert Chen. The money from the strongbox had been returned to the victims' families, along with accumulated interest and compensation from the federal government. Margaret would be proud, Morrison said quietly as they left the courthouse. 25 years of undercover work, and it came together exactly as she planned. Boone had survived his heart episode, though the veterinarians warned his condition remained serious. The old retriever now spent his days sleeping in patches of sunlight on the cabin's front porch, occasionally rousing himself to inspect visitors. The collar around Boone's neck was new, bright red leather with a brass nameplate that read, Boone Thorne, Hero Dog. Martha Wilson from the general store had become a regular visitor, bringing homemade treats for both Ellie and Boone. Other residents of Bitter Hollow gradually accepted the new Thorne sister, especially after she began offering basic medical care from the cabin's front room, the only health care available for miles. "Have you given any thought to Morrison's offer?" Kyle asked, as they walked through Denver's streets toward the parking garage. The FBI had offered Ellie a position as a consultant, drawing on her medical experience in conflict zones to assist in other long-term investigations. "I'm still considering it," Ellie replied truthfully. "But right now, I think Boone and I both need some quiet time to figure out what comes next." What came next might include more of Agent Morrison's company. Their shared experience had created a bond that extended beyond professional cooperation, and his visits to the cabin had become increasingly frequent. That evening, as Ellie helped Kyle prepare dinner in Maggie's restored kitchen, he asked the question she'd been expecting for weeks. "What are you going to do with the rest of your life, Ellie Thorne?" She looked around the cabin that had become her home, at the dog who had shown her the way to redemption, at the man who had brought both danger and purpose back into her world. For the first time since David's death, the future held possibilities that excited rather than terrified her. "I'm going to live it," she said simply. "Every day, every moment, in a way that honors the people who didn't get that chance." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded Ellie of hope rather than loss. Boone dozed by the fireplace, occasionally twitching in dreams of younger days. The walking stick Maggie had carved still leaned against the cabin's wall, its intricate designs telling a story Ellie now understood. It spoke of patience and craftsmanship, of time spent in quiet contemplation while wrestling with demons. Tomorrow, Ellie would begin carving her own walking stick using tools Maggie had left behind. It would be different from her sister's creation, reflecting her own journey and the lessons she'd learned about courage, sacrifice, and the possibility of redemption. Some folks say a woman can lose everything and still find her way back. Ellie Thorne had learned that sometimes the journey home requires traveling through darkness and danger, guided by the loyalty of an old dog and the memory of a sister who never stopped believing in justice. Sometimes that journey leads exactly where it's supposed to,